The next session is How to be a Dictator, the Cult of Personality in the 20th Century. We have Frank Dikotter in conversation with Rajini Vaidyanathan. May we please have the speakers on stage. Rajini Vaidyanathan is BBC South Asia correspondent covering India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Nepal and more. She appears across BBC TV, radio and online. Her recent coverage includes the Indian elections, Sri Lanka terror attacks and an interview with the Dalai Lama. She was previously Washington Correspondent and anchor covering the Trump campaign and election. May we please request Rajini to introduce the speaker, please. Thanks.
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this session here in the lovely Charbagh. This session, as was already explained, is called How to be a Dictator, and it's with Frank Dikotter. Now, Frank Dikotter's written more than a dozen books on modern China, including Mao's Great Famine, and he won the Samuel Johnson Prize for Non-Fiction for that in 2011. But we're going to be talking and listening about his latest book, How to be a Dictator, the Cult of Personality in the 20th Century. So Frank's going to talk about his book, and then we're going to have a little bit of a discussion between us. But like we like to do with these sessions, try and open it up to your questions as soon as we can. So off.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you hear me? Is this microphone on? This microphone number 7. Yes, I can hear it go up. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm absolutely delighted to be here to talk about how to be a dictator. As a matter of curiosity, could I just ask, how many dictators do we have in the audience here this afternoon? I see a couple of hands. Very good, very good. You know, my wife is in the audience. She's a dictator. When I'm home, I'm not allowed to slurp my noodles. She says I make too much noise. She's a dictator. My boss in the history department at the University of Hong Kong is a dictator. I have to tell him each year what it is I want to teach. And then we have a dean. Well, he's just a fascist. He decides at the end of each year whether I should get a pay increase. Quite frankly, I think I should be the judge of that. Now, as you can tell, it's enormous fun to use the word dictator, but it probably won't get us very far. It's been bandied around a great deal. So let me give you a definition. A dictator has a monopoly over power. It's really as simple as that. The entire 20th century is divided into 2 systems. It's all related to power. There's one system in which people try to separate powers, executive, legislative, an independent judicial system, an opposition party, checks and balances on power. And then there is another camp where regimes try to concentrate power. Mussolini said it very clearly. Everything within the state, nothing outside of the state, and nothing without the state. Whether it was in the Soviet Union at the time, or whether it is in the People's Republic of China today, there is no major organization outside of the organization of the Communist Party. Now, that's called a monopoly of power. So now that we've got that one out of the way, can we move on and talk about how to be a dictator? I can see people in the back tell me that it's not loud enough. Is there anybody here who would like to become a dictator beyond those who already are? I can assure you it is tough. I see one hand over there. Let me warn you, young man, there is no retirement plan for dictators. You will make so many enemies, you will have to purge left, right, and center. You will not be able to go back to your stamp collection at the age of 60. There is another problem. It is not so easy to do. It is very hard work. So, my book, How to Be a Dictator, is unfortunately not a ladybird book. It is not like how to ride a bicycle or how to cook a healthy meal under 15 minutes. There are no 12 rules on how to become a dictator. There are no 15 overarching characteristics of all dictators. These people, in the end, are quite unique and operate in quite unique circumstances. All of them, of course, are students of power. That's how they did it. They read about dictators and they study other dictators, learning from each other. And that is precisely what I have done. How to Be a Dictator traces every step 8 dictators took to acquire power and keep it. Which ones are they? Well, I start with Mussolini, then the usual suspects: Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Kim Il-sung in North Korea, and 3 minor ones. One of these is Duvalier, François Duvalier, Papa Doc in Haiti. I also have Ceausescu in Romania, if only because he's barking mad. And then finally Mengistu. You may not have heard of him, but he is one of Africa's great mass murderers, overthrowing the Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974. Now, what comes out of this book? What comes out of it is that most dictators really have 2 instruments of power. And they seem to be a little bit at odds. There is terror on the one hand and worship on the other, or what I call the cult of personality. Fear and love, so to speak, although the love, as you will see soon enough, is actually also fear. Now, when it comes to the terror, we know a great deal about it already. We know about the camps and the prisons. We know about the knock on the door in the middle of the night, the atrocious crimes against humanity. But we know a lot less about the cult of personality, even though hundreds of millions of ordinary people had to cheer their own leaders, even when they were led down the road to serve them. Across large parts of the planet in the 20th century, many ordinary people had to bow to the portrait of their dictator. They had to recite his work, chant his name, extol his genius, proclaim their undying love for the man who was actually oppressing them. At the very heart of the cult of personality, there is a paradox. The paradox of the modern dictator is that he must create the illusion of popular support. The reason for this you already know. As I said earlier on, the 20th century is an age of democracy. The people are supposed to be sovereign and select their leader. But dictators decided to seize power through a coup or by rigging the system. They had to create the illusion of popular consent. They realized that power obtained through violence must be maintained by even more violence. But violence is a very blunt instrument. Of course, you need military forces, spies, informants, torturers. But it's much better if you can create the impression that coercion is actually consent. A dictator who can force his own people to acclaim him in public will last a lot longer. Now, of course, a dictator must instill fear into his own people, but also into his immediate entourage. Just think about it. A dictator is somebody who seized power often over the bodies of his own opponents. But by seizing power, he raises the possibility that someone else might do the exact same thing to him. There is the fear of the stab in the back. How should a dictator deal with his immediate entourage, number 2, 3, 4, and 5? They're all equally ambitious. They're all equally ruthless, waiting in the wings. While there are many strategies to deal with rivals and allies alike, there is, of course, endless purges in dictatorships. There are also, needless to say, other strategies like manipulation or divide and rule. But here too, again, the cult of personality comes in rather handy. The dictator towers above the others and has allies and rivals collaborate in common subordination. Not only that, but when number 2, 3, 4, and 5, all of those who belong to the inner court must acclaim their dictator in public and praise his name, they become liars. And when everybody lies, it becomes very difficult to find out who believes what. And then it becomes impossible to organize a coup. So in the end, a dictator surrounds himself by liars and sycophants. Now, who built up this cult of personality? There are, of course, photographers, there are editors, poets, writers, powerful ministries of propaganda, sometimes entire branches of industry. But ultimately, the dictator is the one responsible for building up his own cult. By some accounts, Mussolini took about 50% of his time to cultivate his own image, besides running a number of powerful ministries. He studied his every gesture in the projection room of his villa Torlonia, which he acquired in 1925. He projected vitality, power. He exposed himself to the population, millions of them, in countless whirlwind tours of the country, visits to villages, frequently unannounced, and mass meetings with workers. His image was everywhere, on books, on walls, on fences. As Italo Balbo said, one of his collaborators, one of the fascist leaders, Italy is a newspaper in which Mussolini writes the first page every day. The same goes for Adolf Hitler. He was tireless at building up his own image and tireless at building up his own party. He was a self-publicist, an actor, orator, choreographer. He hired a photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, in the middle of the 1920s to produce images of steely determination and fanatical willpower. I will not try to imitate him. In 1933, when he was finally given power and became chancellor, he started working on his broadcasting skills. Now his voice became inescapable. His image was already everywhere. There were pillar loudspeakers in cities, mobile loudspeakers taken to the countryside. Leni Riefenstahl made him the star in a number of movies. In all cases, these dictators build up their own cult of personality. Still, frequently, expressions of devotion to a dictator seem to be so spontaneous on the part of the people that many outsiders, sometimes to this very day, believe that they were genuine. We have been told that millions adored Hitler, millions adored Stalin, millions adored Mao. I have no doubt that that is true. But the exact opposite would be true too. Millions did not like Hitler or Stalin or any one of their leaders. The point is, we don't know. The very first casualty of any dictatorship is freedom of expression. How would you know what people think? In Nazi Germany in 1933, 100,000 ordinary people were thrown into jails. There were hundreds of thousands of brown shirts who would chase down the road any and all opponents to the regime. Still, sometimes we think that love for these people was widespread. But you have to remember that dictators had great skills. One of them was acting. They could hide their feelings. Adolf Hitler once said that he was Europe's finest actor. But equally ordinary people were great actors. They had to stand up on command. They had to cheer the leader. They had to recite his work. They have to show their loyalty at any one moment. They have to jump up and shout the slogans. Those who failed to play along were fined, imprisoned, occasionally executed. The point I'm trying to make is not that few subjects adored their leader, but that nobody knew who believed what. Nobody knew who believed what. People had to do what they were asked to do. The point of the cult of personality was not to persuade or convince people. It was to destroy common sense, sow confusion, isolate individuals, crush their dignity. Just imagine that you must stand up in front of your friends and family and proclaim your undying love for the very man you hate most. It will crush you. What the cult of personality did is it created self-censorship. And then in turn, people started monitoring each other. As I said in the beginning, terror on the one hand, worship on the other. The terror is there with the aim to police every street. But the cult of personality aimed to police the mind of every subject. Still, sometimes it seemed that all of this was rather spontaneous. In some cases, the cult of personality almost seemed like a secular form of religion. This too was deliberately cultivated by the dictators themselves. Mussolini, for instance, encouraged feelings of devotion which were derived from Christian piety. In fascist Italy, there were holy pictures, there were holy sites, pilgrimages, the hope of a healing touch from the leader in Rome. Hitler portrayed himself as a messiah in a mystical bond united with the crowd. In the case of Papa Doc Duvalier, he very deliberately encouraged rumors about his otherworldly powers. He assumed the air of a voodoo priest, occasionally appearing with dark glasses, a top hat and a tailcoat, imitating Baron Samedi, the voodoo spirit of the dead, guardian of cemeteries. He would mumble in a deep nasal tone, as if chanting incantations against his very enemies. In all these cases, religion was important. It was used. In particular, so in communist regimes, simply because the tenets of Marxism, Leninism were incomprehensible to the majority of the population. Who could possibly understand the political philosophy of dialectical materialism? The leaders knew this all too well and transformed their leaders into religious icons, starting with Lenin. The moment the Orthodox Church was crushed in the Soviet Union, Lenin emerged as a new icon. When he died, Stalin had him embalmed and displayed on Red Square, where he's worshipped like a saint. I'll speak for another minute, and then we will have a conversation. The point here is not only that dictators lied to their own people, and that they, in turn, were lied to by their entourage. Dictators also lied to themselves. A few of them began believing in their own genius. They veered off into a world of their own, and as a consequence, began taking all major decisions on their own, with devastating consequences for millions of people. Think about the Second World War. Think about the Great Leap Forward. They surrounded themselves with sycophants. They teetered between paranoia on the one hand and hubris on the other. They became suspicious of everyone. They saw enemies at home and abroad. As a result, they tried to have even more power to protect the power they already had. And because they took all decisions on their own, even a minor miscalculation could have fatal consequences. So in the end, the people were a threat to dictators, their entourage was a threat to dictators, but the dictators were also a threat to themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank, for that enlightening insight into the mind, psyche, and of course the cult of personality that in many ways defines what a dictator is. We're going to have a quick chat for maybe about 10, 15 minutes or so, just a little bit about the book, and then we will open it up for questions. I'm sure a lot of you do have questions. The first thing I wanted to ask you is, just very quickly, if you could just remind everyone here of the 8 dictators that you chose to profile.
Yes, again, Mussolini, and the predictable ones, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, of course, Kim Il-sung in North Korea, and then 3 minor ones, although extraordinarily important because they do shed light on the big ones, so to speak. And they're also fascinating in their own right, namely Papa Doc or François Duvalier in Haiti, Ceausescu in the case of Romania, and Mengistu in Ethiopia.
There are many dictators, you said in your book, that you didn't profile. You mentioned Khomeini, Gaddafi, Assad, Mugabe. So why did you pick these 8 profiles?
Well, diversity apparently is a very good thing, and I embrace it.
It definitely is.
So you don't want to have too many dead white men in there, although, of course, they were the most ferocious ones. It was a very difficult choice to come up with one dictator from every part of the world. That was one consideration. Another consideration is that I like to do research on the basis of primary material. So that means that it's best if I can actually read some of the languages that are important here. Now, I can handle most of the European languages, and I had a helper to translate Amharic texts for me in Ethiopia. And I sat next to somebody in the archives in Bucharest who helped me work my way through Romanian, which, by the way, is extraordinarily similar to French, so it wasn't exactly all that tough. When it comes to Kim Il-sung, of course, North Korea, well, most of the archives really are in Moscow and in Berlin, because the East Germans and Soviets had access to North Korea more so than anyone else, so that saved me there. I could have added Gaddafi for the Arabic world, but I thought it was just too much, too many languages I can't handle. So why 8? Well, that's a good question. Why not 7? Why not 9? There's a point where you think that the aim of the book is to illustrate diversity and unity, of course. So beyond 8, I no longer think it has a useful function. But then again, who knows, I might do a second volume on 8 others.
Follow up. You talked about your research process and reading different languages to get some of the primary sources. Much of what you said just then was about uncovering the personality, the mindset behind the way these people think and act. How can you find that out? I mean, how can you read into what someone might have been thinking however many years ago?
Well, you can't. It's as simple as that. I'm not a psychologist. To start with, if you were to try to find out what the psychology of these dictators was, you would have to go back to their childhoods. And many of them were rather obscure people. We don't have any evidence about them whatsoever. So you can really only go back to factual information. What is it they said? What is it they did? And then you must somehow bring that together in a narrative that illustrates the choices that they made. Now, clearly, when a dictator spends a great deal of his time, as they all do, purging and purging and purging, Stalin until the very last years of his life, including family members, I think it's a reasonable assumption that they are a little concerned and possibly paranoid. But I agree that there could be a very different interpretation. One might say that they were absolutely irrational. There's no paranoia there at all. It is rational for a dictator to purge. In fact, as is the case with all my 8 cases, it helps a great deal if you can get rid of your friends before you tackle your foes. And to make errors also helps a great deal. Kill the wrong people, provided you also kill the right ones.
This might sound like a strange question, but sometimes people ask this. Actually, before I came to this session, people were saying, well, can dictators exist in a democracy?
I think it's a terrific, terrific question. The answer is no. A dictator has a monopoly over power. That was the definition, I will admit, but I failed to include it in the book. I thought it would be pretty clear what a dictator is. This is one of the things I've learned since I published the book. People will approach me, having read the book, and say that their wife, their boss, their leader is a dictator. Now, I understand the issue here. There is something about leaders who might not have a monopoly over power, but we feel quite rightly concerned about.
That's more of a personality trait then.
Exactly. So what is the term I would use for those? I mean, vigilance, eternal vigilance is the price of democracy. But when we feel concerned about certain leaders who operate within a context of separation of powers, it seems to me that the word de-democratization is much better. If you are concerned about the United States, about Germany, about Britain, about Japan, possibly about India, although I couldn't see why, then maybe the term de-democratization is better than using the term dictator. I'll tell you why. There are 3 reasons for this. First of all, if you use the term dictator, it might just be that you sound a little bit ignorant. You clearly don't know what a dictator is. But secondly, let us bear in mind the many, many tens of millions of people who died at the hands of these dictators. These people are dead. They cannot come back to say that we trivialize what happened to them throughout the entire course of the 20th century. But thirdly, and more importantly so, once you start referring to somebody who operates in a democracy as a dictator, you actually become like the enemy. It is dictators who say that our democracy is a sham democracy. It is the Adolf Hitlers and Joseph Stalins and Xi Jinpings of our time who tell us that our independent judicial system isn't really independent. It is manipulated by Jews or capitalists or foreigners or counter-revolutionaries. It is they who say that our free press is not truly free. Duvalier Papadoc was probably one of the very first to use the term fake news. Not about the press in Haiti, which he had obviously crushed, but news from abroad, which was negative. He called it fake news. So let us not become like the enemy and use a more functional term of de-democratization. And of course, there are great concerns about that around the world.
You mentioned the press. How much does a dictator have to rely on total control of the press?
Well, it's instant. Mussolini has his march on Rome in 1922. What the black shirts do, the fascists, on the way to Rome, is seize the presses of the newspapers and destroy them. 3 years later, by 1925, there is no free press left in Italy. Adolf Hitler, same story, is granted power on the 30th of January. Within months, the free press is crushed. Trade unions are banned in May. In June, all opposition parties and their newspapers are abolished. It is the very first casualty of any dictatorship, and it happens very rapidly indeed.
You also talk in your book about other tools that enable dictators, like the military and the intelligence services. Tell us a little bit more about that relationship.
Well, since one of the instruments of control is terror, quite clearly the military, the secret police, all of this matters a great deal. But I think that what is so interesting, in all the cases I picked, and in other cases I can think of, is that while we know so much about the secret police and the camps and the gulag and the interrogators, we tend to forget that it all comes at a certain cost. You cannot really place a policeman, a soldier, behind every single individual all the time. So this is why I think, again, the cult of personality is so much more effective. Let people monitor their own thoughts. Let people monitor the thoughts of other people. Make sure that no one dares to say a word against the leader and his regime. That's the best police.
You say in your book that dictators are weak people, not strong ones. Do you think it's easier to be a dictator or to not be one, and to be a leader who's democratically elected?
Well, of course, it sounds rather odd to say that the dictator is weak, but I say that in the context of the very initial phase, so to speak. They seize power frequently because they're unable to be elected by majority. Mussolini does participate in elections, does not get enough votes to have even one fascist sit in parliament. And that's when he opts for the march on Rome, the coup, the seizure of power, which of course the Bolsheviks tried in 1917, themselves having lost the elections as well. Adolf Hitler is sometimes said by people who don't read history very carefully that he was elected, but he was not. He was granted power by Paul Hindenburg, who made him chancellor in January 1930. 3 weeks later, Reichstag, a parliament, is set on fire. Adolf Hitler alleges that there is a communist plot underway. Terror immediately fans out. And even then, in March 1933, he fails to obtain an absolute majority. So all of them, in that sense, are rather weak.
I'm going to open it up to questions very quickly. One more question from me. Just glancing down that list of people that you profiled and the ones that you wanted to profile, obviously none of them are women.
Indeed.
Is there something we can read into that?
Well, there's, of course, a simple answer and a more complicated one. The simple answer is that the 20th century is, by and large, a man's world. In other words, there's a great amount of gender discrimination. And one might imagine that given equal opportunities, a woman or two would probably be capable of doing precisely as atrocious a job as male dictators. But it's true that there isn't much evidence for that. Sometimes when we try to find a female dictator, we think of Isabel Perón, who was married to Juan Perón in Argentina. She had death squads who were responsible for killing hundreds. But ultimately, she failed to control her own entourage and didn't last very long. There is Jiang Qing, who was, of course, the chairman's wife in the People's Republic of China. But she, too, was a mere tool of the chairman who manipulated her the same way that he manipulated everyone else. If I would have to give my vote to a budding potential female dictator in the 20th century, it would probably be the dreadful Elena Ceausescu. And when you study the Ceausescus, after a while you realize that she truly is the brain behind her husband. And it wouldn't
Most
be
women are.
very difficult to imagine that had Ceausescu died, Elena Ceausescu would have carried on very successfully. But we will never know.
Thank you very
Or
much.
I hope we will never know.
Maybe that's your next book. Female dictators. I think we'll open it up for questions.
It'll
We've
be
got
very
about
short.
25 minutes, but I'm very aware that whenever I do these sessions, there are people who don't get to answer or ask, should I say, questions. So let's start with the lady at the front here. Questions? Oh no, the lady there in the check. There, thanks. And questions, not statements, please.
So you spoke a little about dictators in a democracy, and you don't agree with the term, but when we talk about dictators in a democracy, we talk about leaders like, we're sitting in India, so Narendra Modi as such, causing riots in 2002 in Gujarat, killing a lot of people, a lot of dictator-like tendencies. So diving into the 7 men in the book, do you see any similarities in the current world leaders that you see, specifically Narendra Modi?
Yes. Well, I don't know enough about India, and besides that, I have a policy of trying to be polite whenever I am in a country that is not really mine.
Probably advised.
But having said that, if you wish, I can take the case of Russia. I myself mentioned Putin in the afterword of the book. I mentioned him mainly because he has such an extravagant cult of personality. But strictly speaking, he's not a dictator. I know that you and I think that he's a dreadful man who deserves the title. But Russia is constitutionally a federated republic. There are opponents, political opponents. There are journalists who report critically enough to be assassinated. There are opponents who have been elected onto the Duma of Moscow City. There is an independent judicial system. What I'm trying to say is that he will tamper with that independent judicial system. He will harass his opponents. He will kill journalists. But if Stalin were to be resurrected, come back to life, and walk around the streets of Moscow, he would scoff at his successor. He would say, why do you bother harassing opponents? Why do you simply not ban all opposition parties? Why do you waste time with the press? Just kill all of them and make sure that nothing but propaganda comes out of Moscow. So in that sense, even Putin, unsavory as he may be, operates within an extremely frail yet nonetheless system that recognizes the separation of powers, and he's very obviously walking back on the road towards de-democratization. He is not a man who has a monopoly over power.
You call it de-democratization, democratization. Some people would say, to play devil's advocate, is this not just dictatorship by default? Democracy, but not really.
Well, this is, I think, the danger I alluded to before, is that the one who is most convinced that democracy in the United States is not democracy, that the judicial system in the United States is not independent, that the press in the United States is manipulated, the one who thinks that most is the man in charge of the People's Republic of China. His name is Xi Jinping. So I'm not trying to say that everything is perfect in every democracy around the world. Quite the opposite. Democracies evolve. There are complex systems. This is what happens when you try to separate out powers, have checks and balances, opposition parties, an independent judicial system. All of this evolves over time, is an extraordinarily hard to work with. Whereas on the other hand, concentration of power may not be easy to achieve, but doesn't lead to a very complex system. The man at the top makes the decisions.
Okay, thank you. Let's get some more questions in. Lots of hands going up. Let's go towards the back a little bit. Man there waving his hands. There. Yeah, you, sir.
I just wanted to know, in your perspective, destruction of Iraq, killing thousands and million people by America, is not a dictatorship and bad than what the recently example has been quoted of Narendra Modi, where he has constructed each and every colony of Muslim where rights were there. Today they all are praising him. So who is the bad dictator compared to him? Where the complete Iran has destroyed so many thousands of million of ton TNT was dropped there, that today there is no agriculture farming there in Iraq on those areas.
Again, it's not about scale. It is not even about who kills the most. I've invoked Duvalier, Papa Doc in Haiti. It is remarkable that, in fact, he actually killed very few people. He was utterly ruthless. And as I said, he made mistakes, killing the wrong people. But overall, most Haitians who didn't like the regime were able to leave. The same thing is true for North Korea. A great many people who didn't like Kim Il-sung's regime were able to walk all the way to the south. So it is not about the number of people who were killed or the proportion of the population that was killed. It is about a monopoly over power. Is there a monopoly over power or not? Or something that approaches a monopoly over power? I realize that this is a working definition, and not every dictator will conform to it. And I will give you an example. Mussolini, he's in my book. He curtailed the press. He eliminated all opposition. By 1925, 3 to 4 people were not able to gather without permission from the state. No freedom of association. But there's one thing he couldn't do, namely get rid of the king. Adolf Hitler told him to do so, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't get rid of the king. And the king ultimately was the man who was nominally in charge of the army. And when things went pear-shaped, in 42, 43, it is the king who had Mussolini placed under arrest. That was the end of him.
Thank you. So basically, you're either a dictator or you're not. There's not a kind of A-grade dictator or a C-grade dictator.
You could grade them. Of course, there are many dictators we haven't heard about because they failed on day one. A failed coup.
So does longevity,
I
is
think
that a measure as well?
longevity is very, very important. And of course, we tend, as historians and as readers, I think, to pick the ones who actually manage to live very long lives.
And stay in power,
and stay
in quotes.
In power. And there are not all that many of them. Of course, Stalin died a natural death, although he died in a pool of his own urine, because the fear was such that nobody dared to knock on his door, even when he remained inside for days on end. So it was too late to save him. Mao Zedong also died in his bed of old age in 1976, as did Kim Il-sung. In the case of North Korea, and in the case of Haiti, with Papa Doc, we have dictators who are able to prolong their regime by handing over to a family member. In the case of North Korea, we are now in the third generation, Kim the Third, one might very well say, although that, of course, will not last forever either. So these are truly exceptional dictators. Ceausescu and his horrendous wife, Elena, were, of course, arrested around Christmas 1989 and shot against the toilet block. In the case of Hitler, I think you all remember more or less what happened. Didn't go too well for him, didn't go too well for Germany, in fact, didn't go too well for all of Europe, a major disaster. Mussolini, too, was finally first rescued by Hitler, who couldn't contemplate the fall of a fellow dictator. It would have been a serious tarnishing of the image of the all-powerful dictator. So Hitler rescued him, but still Mussolini ended up being killed by partisans in 1945 and hanging upside down from a girder. So in many cases, the longevity isn't all that great, with a few exceptions.
Okay, right. From those gory details, let's go back to question. The lady in the red just there waving her hand. And then we'll take one from the back next.
Hello there. That was a great analysis of dictators. Thank you. And what I wanted to ask you is what I thought was missing, maybe not stated. At the heart of a dictator, does there lie a great sense of insecurity? I didn't hear you use that word. I just wanted you to clarify.
It's a great question.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, great insecurity and extraordinary confidence. And it's a very strange sort of combination that you find in many of these dictators. And many are insecure even before they get to power, although they still harbor grandiose ideas about their destiny. And you know what happens with power. It's an old saying. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But the point surely is that power also changes the power holder. The issue here is that a dictator can no longer trust anyone. He doesn't know where the stab in the back will come from. So that can only increase his insecurity. Possibly, he might talk to a family member. This is why you have these attempts in some of these dictatorships to pass on power to a family member. But who else could you possibly trust? It's a ferocious world of Darwinism in which you die and I live. Dog eat dog. But then the hubris, the confidence, is also, if you wish, inflated by the handling of power. These people are surrounded by sycophants. They occasionally get very lucky. We should also acknowledge that some of them are actually reasonably able at manipulating people. So there's a point where some of them actually start believing in their own genius. And this is what I meant in my brief talk at the very end when I say that they teeter between paranoia on the one hand and absolute hubris on the other. They feel insecure, yet on the other hand they think they are quite unique, chosen quite literally by destiny. In the case of Chairman Mao, he subjects his population during the Cultural Revolution to an endless cycle of violence in which everyone has to prove their absolute, undying loyalty to the chairman. So many are purged, including people at the very top, that in the end he does feel reasonably secure. Here he is, 4 years before he dies in 1972, feeling secure enough to somehow tone down the entire cult of personality. He's got no peers left, no allies, no rivals.
Okay, just
Having cost, of course, having crushed the lives of hundreds of millions.
just a thought actually, but we'll get to some questions. But I wonder, we'll come to it later. You talk about how dictators die as dictators, but are people born as dictators? But we'll come to that in a bit, because let's get the man in the orange scarf. I said I'd go to the back just there. Yeah.
What are the differences and similarities between king and dictator?
King and a dictator.
It's a very good question. It's a historical question. Thank you so much. A king doesn't care about ordinary people. An emperor doesn't care about ordinary people. A queen doesn't care about ordinary people. What they care about is the aristocracy, people at court. So this is why I start the book with Louis XIV. France was rocked by a rebellion by the aristocracy when he was young. So when he got older, he made sure that the aristocracy would have to vie for his attention. At court, he built Versailles, where aristocracy had to dwell. He played them against each other. He kept an eye on them, as they had to curry favor. But he couldn't care less about ordinary people. This is pre-modern, so to speak. By pre-modern, I mean exactly pre-1789, the French Revolution. Before that, whether you are in France, or in China, or in Africa, there is a divine right to rule. There is no democracy there. People don't queue up to vote at the ballot box. One of the descendants of Louis XIV, Louis XVI, is guillotined after the French Revolution, 1789. From that moment onwards, a whole different political philosophy appears that proclaims that sovereignty is vested not in God, it is not in divine right, it is not in a king or a queen, it resides in the people. And from there onwards, very gradually, this notion of democracy will start unfolding. The great age of democracy is the 20th century. I know this may sound paradoxical, but you cannot have a dictator outside of a democratic context. In fact, the paradox is that every dictator wishes to present himself as being truly democratic. A true dictator will say, you are a fake democracy, we are a real democracy. If you read the preamble to the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, 1984, you will read that it defines the People's Republic as a democratic dictatorship. To you and me, this may sound like a clash of values, but ultimately, the entire 20th century, including dictators, is based on the notion of democracy. So no kings there.
Thank you. Let's get some more questions in. We've got about 10 minutes. Man there, and let's get another woman. We'll do 2 questions. A lady at the front here as well. We take 2 and then we'll answer them together. So first, your question.
Can we look at the what of all this rather than the how? Within democratic institutions, the lack of opportunity, the lack of equality, and the lack of justice creates dictators, and that we, in fact, in terms of failed institutions, deserve the dictators that we get.
Okay, and I'll just get one here and then we'll do them together. So that's...
I understand.
Well, just 1 second. We'll just get this lady's question as well. Yeah.
According to you, who are the top 5 potential dictators of 21st century? For example, my Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Right, well, let's start with that,
Well,
and then we'll move on to...
Let me repeat what I already said. If you feel that you can talk about your leader in a critical way, then you are probably not in a dictatorship. Here is a very simple test. You look at planet Earth. You pick a country that you are interested in. You make your way to that country, you get off the plane, I imagine you will fly, and then you see if you can find people who will be openly critical of the man in charge. Now, if you fly to Washington, I think chances are it'd be very difficult to find people who are not critical of, must I say his name, the Orange Man? In fact, my wife and I spend about 2 months each summer at the Hoover Institution in Palo Alto. I have never encountered anyone who has anything good to say about the Orange Man.
He still has a lot of supporters, just to inject some balance in.
Take your plane and go all the way to Shanghai and see if you can find someone in Shanghai who's willing to openly criticize the man in charge in Beijing. I think chances are probably not. In fact, the National Basketball Association in the United States quite rightly, vigorously criticizes the Orange Man. Good thing. But then they will kneel down and grovel to Beijing. Well, that should tell you where your dictator is.
And the gentleman's question, which was just about what conditions are ripe for a dictatorship as well.
There are many books about the conditions that are ripe for dictators. The truth is, these are all great theories. And it is probably true. These are great theories about extraordinarily different conditions from a quite developed, wealthy country like Germany to a very impoverished island called Haiti. It varies enormously. And it is probably very true to say that countries that have very weak separation of powers, very weak democracies, or possibly none, are very open to dictatorships. It is not unusual for one of these kings or queens or emperors to be overthrown not so much by a group of democrats, but rather by a dictator. So all of that is very, very true. So I think ultimately, the stronger that separation of powers and the longer it's around, the less the likelihood that a dictator will be able to have a monopoly over power. We have moved away in the 21st century from the 1980s, We've moved away from the 1950s. We've moved away from the 1930s. I've read one historian who I normally admire, Christopher Brown, write an article about how the United States is in 1933. I've read a piece by Richard Evans, and other very senior historian, write about how the United Kingdom might possibly be in 1933. And somebody told me a few days ago that India is in 1933. Well, I told you what happened in 1933. Nothing I can see. Nothing I can see here or elsewhere.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. There's a man in a cap there who's had his hand up for a while. Yes, you, sir? Just a little further back. And is there someone at the back we'll go to next? And we'll just get your question first. Thanks.
Hello. Most of the dictators come by nationalism, with the nationalism or a Rashtravad, and then after coming to the power, they don't want to leave the power, and they create friends or a condition of their friends who support them. But the dictators come in different parts of the world in a different way.
What's your question, sir?
Just like Musharraf or the...
So we've only got 4 minutes. Could you just
president.
tell us what your question is, please?
My question is that is it possible to find a way that dictatorship doesn't carry long way?
Can we find a way to limit dictatorship?
I think that's it, yeah.
Can we find a way to limit? Well, yes. Get rid of them, but that's not so simple. People have been trying for a very long time, those living inside dictatorships. A very tough thing to do. I think the real issue is, again, what I mentioned earlier on, de-democratization. You know, is there a point where somebody who has come to power through an election will turn himself into a dictator? But even that, if you look at the historical record, is extraordinarily difficult to do. I mean, think of Mugabe. Somebody once told me you should have done Mugabe, not Mengistu. But Mugabe himself, until the very end of his life, was fighting with the opposition party and was fighting with the courts. Now, what kind of dictator fights with the courts? A dictator decides what the law is. His word is the law.
Thank you. Lady there with the red... Yeah, you at the back there, and I think that's probably our last question.
Just stick to the question. Okay, so I just wanted to ask about the personality cult part. And as we're seeing in the world, the personality cult is rising, as in this country also. So do you think like democratically elected authoritarian leaders can eventually end up in a situation where it's a like... where it functions like a dictatorship?
I think we've already covered that. Do you want to say anything else on that?
Yes, I think, again, let me insist that a cult of personality is not seeing portraits of a dictator everywhere. It's not having people sing his praises. A cult of personality means that you no longer know who thinks what. Not only do you not know who thinks what, but you would never dare to say anything against the man in charge. That's a cult of personality.
Okay, we have got time for one more. Glasses, this gentleman here, yeah.
So you stated that Putin can't be a dictator just because he has distributed the power. But wasn't that the same case with Hitler itself? He also had distributed the power, but he's one of the biggest dictators of the time.
Well, Mussolini, as I mentioned, was in charge of something like 6 ministries. Hitler, I wouldn't call him a lazy man, but what he did is give the same task to different people and let them compete amongst each other. Let them vie for his attention. It's called divide and rule. But ultimately, Adolf Hitler has a monopoly over power.
Okay, we've got a minute left. I've got one final question to ask you, which is, do you think as we go forward, the way the world is now is more ripe for more dictatorships or less than the last century?
There are a lot of concerns about de-democratization. And I am as concerned as anyone else. I live in Hong Kong. My work is on the People's Republic of China. Do you think I'm not concerned about de-democratization? People are fighting in Hong Kong to preserve those very little bits of freedom that were allowed somehow to keep and being undermined every day by the People's Republic of China. So of course I'm concerned about de-democratization and dictatorship. But it doesn't mean that comparisons with the 1930s are very helpful. What one ought to do, operating within the framework of separation of powers, is find ways to consolidate the separation of powers, increase checks and balances. I think that is being done very quietly in a great number of countries. Of course, we're always concerned and focused on key problems. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's good to keep at least some sense of perspective. Now, you can do two things to acquire a sense of perspective. You can wait till you are very old. It helps. I'm 58. Or you can read history. So please, ladies and gentlemen, read history.
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, please buy his book. He's going to be
Thank
signing
you.
copies of it after this session. Thank you very much for an
Thank
engaging
you.
and illuminating discussion, Frank. And as I say, he will be signing copies of his book. So there you go. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for the wonderful session speakers. The Z Jaipur Literature Festival is also proud to partner with AirAsia India, part of the Tata Group, to raise awareness about the climate and work towards a greener and more sustainable future. Together, we are creating a literature forest with individual trees in honor of the speakers at JLF to reduce the carbon footprint by planting trees. One tree can offset 20 kilograms of carbon in a year. This afternoon, we are honoring our speakers with certificates for this initiative.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for you to win something. So one of you lucky members in the audience is sitting on the Zomato hot seat. You just need to turn around and check if your backrest has the sticker. Oh, we have a winner. Please bring the sticker and claim your prize. We have a Zomato hamper waiting for you. Congratulations. Let's hear it for our lucky winner. The next session will begin shortly. I request the audience to kindly occupy the front rows first and to also turn their phones on silent mode. Thank you.